Branch Davidians. On the morning of February 28, 1993, 76 ATF agents in cattle trailers pulled up to a sprawling compound 9 miles east of Waco, Texas, and attempted to serve a search warrant on a community of several hundred people living under the authority of a man named David Koresh. The raid lasted less than 2 hours. 4 agents were killed. 6 Branch Davidians died. The ATF retreated. What followed was a 51-day standoff that ended on April 19th when fire destroyed the compound and killed 76 people inside, including 25 children. The Branch Davidians had been living at Mount Carmel Center since the 1950s as a splinter group of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. Koresh had seized leadership in the mid-1980s through a combination of scriptural mastery and personal charisma. He taught that he was the final prophet, the only man capable of opening the 7 seals of Revelation. That belief gave him total authority over members' finances, labor, diet, and sexual lives. He declared the right to take any woman in the community as a spiritual wife, including minors, and fathered children with multiple members. The ATF had been investigating weapons violations, specifically the illegal conversion of semi-automatic rifles, for months before the February raid. Here is the detail that still generates debate. The ATF knew Koresh left the compound regularly. He jogged outside. He went to gun shows. He was accessible. Former ATF officials and independent investigators have argued publicly that Koresh could have been arrested on the road without a military-style compound assault. Why the agency chose the raid format has never been fully explained to investigators' satisfaction. The 51-day standoff became a negotiation in which the FBI gradually cut off the compound's electricity, broadcast loud music and recordings of slaughtered rabbits through speakers at night, and moved armored vehicles closer each week. Koresh kept promising to surrender after he finished a manuscript interpreting the 7 seals. On April 19th, the FBI inserted CS gas into the compound. Fire broke out. The cause of the fire, whether it was set by members, started accidentally, or was caused by the gas insertion, remains disputed in the forensic record. Congress held 2 sets of hearings. The Justice Department produced 2 reports. No federal official faced criminal charges. The compound site is now a memorial. Every year on April 19th, people come. The Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. In April 1985, 200 federal and state law enforcement officers surrounded a 224-acre compound in the Ozark Mountains on the Arkansas-Missouri border. Inside were approximately 100 members of a Christian identity paramilitary community that had been preparing for a race war since 1976. They had an armored personnel carrier. They had a large stockpile of weapons and explosive materials. They had a chemical they believed could be used as a poison. The standoff lasted 4 days. It ended peacefully. No shots were fired. The CSA, as members called it, had been founded by James Ellison, a former traveling preacher, who had received what he described as a divine vision, instructing him to build a survivalist fortress in preparation for the collapse of American society. Members trained in combat. They ran a paramilitary school that outsiders could attend for a fee. They manufactured illegal weapons. They believed Jewish people and people of color were the enemies of Christian civilization. Ellison's community had been on the FBI's radar for years. The pivot is that the CSA had already crossed the line from belief into action well before the raid. Members were later linked to the 1983 bombing of a natural gas pipeline in Missouri, a 1984 arson at a church in Indiana, and plots against federal buildings and infrastructure. The FBI moved in 1985 after a CSA member was arrested in Arkansas carrying explosives and a rocket launcher. The peaceful surrender was the result of negotiations involving an Arkansas state trooper and a Christian identity minister who convinced Ellison to stand down. Ellison received a 20-year sentence. He cooperated with federal prosecutors, providing testimony against other white supremacist networks, and was released after 5 years. Most accounts of the raid end there. What they skip is what the raid produced as intelligence. The documents and membership records seized at the compound gave federal investigators their most detailed map to date of the interconnected Christian identity and white supremacist networks operating across the United States at that time. The community is gone. The network it belonged to was not. Yearning for Zion Ranch. On April 3, 2008, Texas law enforcement and Child Protective Services entered the Yearning for Zion Ranch outside El Dorado, Texas, acting on a phone call from a girl who claimed she was 16, pregnant, and being abused inside the compound. Over the following days, authorities removed 439 children, the largest child custody action in American history. The ranch belonged to the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the same organization then being led by Warren Jeffs from a prison cell in Utah where he was awaiting transfer to face charges in Arizona. The FLDS had purchased the Texas property in 2003, specifically because Texas had no history of investigating the community. They built a white limestone temple, a cannery, a dairy, a school, and housing for hundreds of families, and they assumed the isolation of West Texas would function the same way the Utah-Arizona border had for decades, as a buffer between their practices and the law. The phone call changed everything. Or rather, the phone call is where the story gets complicated. Texas investigators later concluded they could not verify that the caller, a young woman who identified herself as Sarah, was actually inside the YFZ ranch. She may have been a woman in her 30s in Colorado making a false report. That finding produced a legal crisis. Defense attorneys for FLDS families argued the entire raid had been based on a fraudulent tip. The Texas Supreme Court initially ruled that the mass removal of children had been improper. Most children were returned to their families. Here is the detail that flipped the story again. DSNI testing conducted during the custody proceedings identified dozens of girls who had been pregnant before the age of 18 inside the compound. The testing connected those pregnancies to specific adult men. Warren Jeffs, already convicted in Utah and Arizona, was extradited to Texas. In 2011, he was convicted of aggravated sexual assault and sentenced to life plus 20 years. 7 other FLDS men received sentences ranging from 6 to 75 years. The phone call may have been false. The evidence it uncovered was not. The Montana Freemen. On March 25, 1996, the FBI surrounded a farm called Justice Township near Jordan, Montana, where a group of anti-government extremists had been holed up conducting what they described as a sovereign citizen court, issuing their own legal documents, liens, and financial instruments. The Freemen had filed bogus liens against judges, sheriffs, and federal officials totaling over $1 billion. They had issued their own money orders, drawn on accounts that did not exist, and passed them to unsuspecting businesses across several states. They had also declared themselves outside the jurisdiction of the United States government entirely. The standoff lasted 81 days, longer than Waco, longer than Ruby Ridge, and ended without a single shot fired or a single death. The Montana Freemen were not a religious group in the traditional sense. They drew their ideology from Christian identity theology, the Posse Comitatus movement, and an elaborate legal theory holding that the Federal Reserve, the income tax, and the court system were fraudulent constructions with no binding authority over sovereign Christian men. Their leader, Leroy Schweitzer, had been developing and teaching his paper terrorism techniques, the fake liens, the fake financial instruments, to followers across the country for years before the standoff. The FBI's approach at Jordan was deliberately calibrated against the lessons of Waco and Ruby Ridge. No loud music, no armored vehicles grinding toward the fence. Negotiators spoke to the Freemen daily. Intermediaries, including Bo Gritz, a right-wing activist with credibility inside the movement, came out to the farm to talk. The Freemen eventually surrendered when they ran out of food and options. Schweitzer received a 22-year sentence. But here is the detail the standoff obscured. The paper terrorism techniques Schweitzer had been teaching spread dramatically during and after the standoff because the media coverage inadvertently documented the methods. Sovereign citizen filings in federal and state courts increased sharply in the years after 1996. The FBI today classifies the sovereign citizen movement as a domestic terrorist threat. Jordan, Montana is a small town. Schweitzer's classroom turned out to have no walls. Rajneeshpuram. In October 1985, federal and Oregon state investigators raided the headquarters of a religious organization that had, over the previous 4 years, built a self-contained city of 7,000 people in the high desert of Waco County, Oregon, incorporated it as a municipality, fielded its own police force with semi-automatic weapons, run its own public transportation system, and poisoned the salad bars of 10 restaurants in the Dalles, Oregon, sickening 751 people in the first successful bioterrorism attack on American soil. The FBI already knew about the city. They had been watching it for 3 years. What they did not know, what almost no one outside the inner circle knew, was the scale of what had been planned and executed from inside its borders. Rajneeshpuram had been built by followers of the Indian spiritual teacher Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who preached a philosophy combining Eastern mysticism, Western therapy, and radical personal freedom. Rajneesh himself wore custom-designed robes and collected Rolls-Royces, 93 of them by the time the compound fell. His personal secretary, a woman named Ma Anand Sheila, ran the day-to-day operations of the city with absolute authority. The Salmonella attack was her operation. She had ordered it to suppress voter turnout in a local election the Rajneeshis were trying to influence by making residents too sick to vote. Investigators did not connect the poisoning to the commune for a full year. The case broke open not through federal investigation, but because Rajneesh himself called a press conference in September 1985 and accused Sheila of a criminal conspiracy, apparently to deflect attention from his own legal exposure on immigration fraud charges. Sheila had already fled to Europe. The FBI raided the compound, found wiretapping equipment, a clandestine medical laboratory, and evidence of additional plots, including a planned assassination of a U.S. attorney. Sheila was extradited, convicted, and served 29 months before being released. Rajneesh was deported. He died in India in 1990. The city of Rajneeshpuram was dissolved. The ranch it occupied was purchased by a Christian organization and is now a youth camp. The water glasses on those salad bars in the Dalles have never fully left the public health literature.